Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to episode 3 now of the Rent Free Hockey Podcast. Today we've got a bit of a Valentine's Day special for you where we're going to be doing some matchmaking and match breaking, and so we're really looking forward to talking about each of the 7 teams in the Canadian Division, or North Division as they call it, which I'm not a fan of. Canadian Division, I think, is a lot punchier.
Yeah, don't even care who it's sponsored by.
I know, right?
It's the Canadian Division.
Yeah.
Let's be real.
Yeah, so we're going to quickly start off with a bit of a callback to our very first episode where we made some predictions about some of the make-or-break players for each team. We just want to have a couple things we want to touch on there. We're not going to talk about all the teams, so if yours doesn't come up, stick around or check the timestamps below. We've got lots to say about them a little later. So first off, we want to talk about the Maple Leafs, who are just having a time in the Canadian Division so far. Really kind of imposing their will and looking really strong.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to...
Well, definitely one of the things that we were talking about, right, was just the fact that this team was probably going to be the best team in the Canadian Division for the regular season. I think I was pretty explicit about saying specifically for the regular season, and that's panning out. But what's interesting is it's not entirely because of the reasons that I suspect. Now, okay, a guy like Matthews has gone off lately. He had 8-goal streak, right? 8-game goal streak.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he's gone off, but really, like, this team isn't trying to necessarily outgun all the other teams, but I noticed there's a lot more of, risky playmaking and just playing shifts just to try again a different shift, right? Instead of trying to force goals. So it's something that Ferraro's also said where, he notices that's a bit of a trend for the Leafs. And what's interesting about that is that I don't think the Leafs are playing on all cylinders. I'm not saying that they're having great puck luck, but I don't think that this team is quite clicking as well as I thought it could, and that could be because of different injuries and different things like that. But I don't think this team has yet to see its full potential offensively or defensively, and yet they're getting wins. So I think that's impressive. And we'll see as there's more adversity and whatever form that comes in for this season. It'll be really interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, something that is different to me about this edition of the Leafs is something I don't think I have ever seen before, which is that it actually seems fun to be a Maple Leaf right now. I can't think of, maybe there have been some hot stretches in the past where that was the case, but it seems like the guys on the team are having fun playing hockey, which if you think of like Marner's last couple of years, even Matthews, obviously he's played really well, but there have been injuries. It's been bumpy for the team. The whole saga with Babcock, there's been tough times, and it just seems like the team is having fun.
Yeah.
And that's huge for team culture. Another thing is I've been really impressed by some of their additions, especially Wayne Simmons. He's been looking really good, and that's really been huge for them, I think. With all that said, if this team was playing an 82-game season this year, just in terms of point percentage, they'd probably finish with, at the rate they're going now, 135-ish points, which would be historic.
Yeah.
And that's not going to continue.
No.
The league is just too competitive. There's just too many things that can go wrong. Hockey is influenced by chance too much for this pace to continue. Even though a guy like Matthews has been killing it, his shooting percentage at the time of recording this video is just a little bit over 20%. And it looks like he averages 14 or 15. So if you knock off a quarter or a third of his goals, what's that do to their season so far?
Yes, fair.
Hard to say, right? In my opinion, this team does look great, but they've looked great in the past too. And it hasn't been their the highest of their highs that have defined this team over the past few years. It's been their lowest lows.
Right.
And so the thing that I am waiting to see is what happens to this team when they face some real adversity. And losing to Ottawa in the season opener is a bummer, but to me that doesn't count.
Right. No.
That's not enough adversity yet. So was that their season opener or game 2? That might have been
Season opener.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Well, it was for the Sens.
Was for the Sens.
Yeah, they only played on a Friday, so
they might have opened against the Habs, but it was game 1 or 2. But either way, that's just something I'm looking forward to seeing what happens when they do hit some adversity. How are they going to respond? So.
Yeah, and well, we weren't maybe going to bring it up this soon, but I'll say it about the Canadiens. This is the Canadiens trope. It's a classic team that always gets off to good starts, especially under Claude Julien, and then it kind of starts to dive down, and maybe we're seeing that inevitability and history start to trend towards that direction again. And so, right, like I'm just bringing that in for talking about sustainability. Mm-hmm. And what you're actually saying about Wayne Simmons, I think, in my mind, also applies to someone like Josh Anderson in the sense that because of so much time between seasons starting and the puck dropping, is that all these guys who were just beleaguered with different kinds of injuries and that they were just nagging in certain different ways, then we've really seen what that extra time has done for players to come back. And like Josh Anderson is playing lights out hockey right now. Wayne Simmons was doing great. He's broke his wrist, unfortunately. So maybe the whole injury theory is not looking flawless, right? In what I'm pointing out. But those are some trends that I'm seeing as well, where some players have really benefited from an extended amount of time off, which we thought is maybe counterintuitive because maybe time off for some players might make them more rusty, but some have come out really strong with extra rest. So.
Yeah, and just a quick note on Josh Anderson, if you're interested in hearing a bit more about his injury and his recovery and kind of the outlook for him moving forwards, go check out our second most recent video where I do a bit of a deep dive into that and what I think it's gonna Habs fans can expect from him moving forwards. But
so I guess like we're talking about the sink and swim, right? So or we're at least reflecting on the sink and swim series that we did to start the year and kind of observing what are some things we got right, what are some things we got wrong. And I think one of the things as we bounce and look around is that if I'm looking in somewhere like Calgary, I'd picked Andrew Mangiapane as my sink or swim candidate. Now, I'm not saying he's the be-all, end-all. He's not the make-or-break factor of this team, but he really epitomized, or I should say personified, their secondary scoring. And just lately, as we begin to record here, he's had a little bit of an uptick. He's got a couple goals now, but really the Flames are really dire and desperate for secondary scoring. I think their top guys are playing great right now. Markstrom is looking really confident in net, and the addition of Tanev, there's clearly some synergy that they're bringing over from Vancouver together. And there's something where, and this isn't a knock on TJ Brody, but this is speaking more to what the Flames needed, is that Tanev is certainly a guy where he is reliable, dependable, predictable, and he's just cool. He's able to make plays that either mitigate offensive chances from the other team, or he's able to have good puck clearance or defense and stuff like that. And so, there seems to be a need for more and more secondary scoring in Calgary because I don't think they're up as high in the standings as maybe some of us were thinking or hoping. So, where else do you want to go?
Well, a quick note would be the Senators. I think I was a little higher on them than I maybe should have been coming into the season, and seeing them beat the Leafs right away had me feeling real good about that prediction, but it's been a tough go. Just really things I think went off the rails in a way that they're not going to be able to recover from. That was one thing. Also, I was a little lower on the Jets than I should have been. I saw them having a lot more problems than they have. I've been really impressed by just their not just their defensemen, but their team defense.
And a lot of resiliency, you see, right? Like
time.
What we're seeing in other teams when you're hearkening back to Ottawa there is that, man, especially, so Ottawa's had some issues. There's been a 9-game road trip that they had, and that's where they suffered right at the end. Some brutal losses to Vancouver. People are starting to think maybe Vancouver's got some life. We'll touch on that later.
Yeah.
At that point, people are thinking Vancouver's maybe got some life. That'll help kickstart how they're doing. But yeah, they just got pummeled after a long road trip, and especially stacking loss upon loss. It would be really hard to just get back into that mindset of feeling like you have a chance, feeling like you can win. And sure enough, they got a bounce their way when they came back home. They're playing the Habs, and they were able to put one away. And really what we've seen since then is they've really trended up in play. They've outshot both the Oilers and the Jets and really outworked those teams. But it's got to be tough to be in that room, to be like, we outplayed that team, we outchanced that team, but we just didn't have the talent to put pucks away and in the net. That's got to be really a tough mentality, and there might be some puck luck. It could be their actual shots don't represent their high danger opportunities, which I think is likely. But yeah, it's got to be a little bit tough to be in that room. That being said, man, I am loving everything about Tim Stützle. This guy is already like an absolute, he's playing like a man out there. You know, we say that like some people need to grow into the league, but some of his decision making and his passing, hand-eye coordination, everything. If you've been watching the Senators, you're seeing all those things. And I think the last thing just to pump the brakes on is a lot of Sens fans are getting outraged about like, oh, now is their window of unparalleled success. Well, no one predicted the Canadian division. No one predicted them going up against teams every single night where they are punching above their weight, right? And so maybe I'm going on just a little bit long about this, but like in other scenarios, they'd be playing teams like Detroit. Even they'd have 2 games a year against Chicago, right, in a regular season. Chicago's not looking as horrible maybe as we thought right now. Still early in the season. But yeah, it's just there's not really any easier games, or there's not too much variation in the quality of competition. So I think, yeah, as Sens fans, just like pump it a little bit. We're projected to be kind of last, and that all these teams consider themselves playoff teams that they're playing against. So yeah, I think it's okay. We don't need to worry about the unparalleled success, like timeline deviating as far. Maybe it gets bumped a couple years, but I think we can cool on that. So we've kind of bumped coast to coast to coast to coast. Let's go all the way over?
Yeah.
Or did you want to talk about Edmonton, or we can save some of that
I would
for later?
say let's go to Vancouver.
Yeah, let's do it.
I was really high on them. I thought it sort of hurt me to put them second, actually, in the division standings to the Leafs, because my feeling about that team was just that they were so complete. They had the high-end talent. It's been a tough go. I don't think you can blame it really on Toffoli. I don't think you can blame it on Markstrom. I don't even think you can blame it on Tanev. Maybe you can blame it on all 3 of them being gone. But I think more so it's becoming clear that what happened in the return to play was probably a bit of a mirage. And if you look at the sample size of the last, year or two of the Canucks, it's been up and down. And I would say at this point, a bit more down than up. And so that is going to bring us into our Valentine's Day, our first Valentine's Day segment.
Yes.
Where we're doing some matchmaking, and it's a bit of a weird way to start, because I don't have a match to make for Vancouver. I have a match to break. And I think that the Canucks and Jim Benning have really tried to make it work. there's been some real highs, and those highs can keep you hanging on when you shouldn't.
Right.
And I think it's time for some ties to be cut there. I think Benning's got to go.
Wow.
I think that he has been propped up by one great trade and some drafting well above statistical averages, which...
a guy like Pedersen.
Yeah.
Right, bailing you out, looking great.
Yeah, Hughes.
Yeah. Hoaglander's looking phenomenal.
Right. So if those guys were the statistical average player to where they were drafted, this team is a lottery team right now. And that's a hard pill to swallow considering where they looked last year, and mostly considering their cap hit as a team, not just now, but for the foreseeable future. I think that the test of time has shown that, by and large, Benning's moves are bad. And, like, sure, there's some question marks about the Eriksson thing. It sounds like that was really pushed by ownership. But if you look at Benning's track record and his other moves, it's like, well, hard to cut him too much slack there and give him the benefit of the doubt. Because there's so much baggage on that team money-wise.
Right.
It's like, how are they going to climb out of this? How are they going to climb out of this spot? Like, what are you going to need from your kids to overcome kind of the baggage elsewhere on the roster? And just this team feels a little broken. And I feel a bit dramatic saying that, but I think it's maybe because I was so high on them coming into it and just kind of believing in the potential. But that can be dangerous, believing in potential when it's just so far from the reality of what's happening. So I think that it's time for a breakup. I think Benning's got to go.
Wow. Okay, that is spicy meatball. Well, you know what? Like, I can see where you're coming from. Like, a guy like, say, signing like Jay Beagle and Anton Roussel, those guys are both combined $6 million on the cap. When you break that down percentage-wise, right? Like, that's like maybe 3 or 4% of your cap space allotted to those guys. And don't get me wrong, some people in Vancouver especially loving Jay Beagle. Anton Roussel brings an edge. Both those guys, I think, combined won't get you to the playoffs, but they can make a difference in the playoffs, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, really, I think what happened was that there was some unsustainable goaltending that really brought... Now, I think Holtby and Demko are both good, but like the amount that when Demko and Markstrom were paired together, how many wins above replacement that those teams were providing, that those players were providing, was really just covering a lot of the concerns in the depth or specifically how they do on the defending side of the game.
Right.
And so, like you said, there's been some great players like, Pedersen. I've watched him a couple times this year. Tough start. I think that, talking back to our sink or swim candidate, when I picked JT Miller, he was out for the first couple games. So I felt pretty vindicated in that decision to be like, JT Miller is really important for the success of Pedersen, right?
Especially on the power play.
Oh, man. Yeah. But like Pedersen, he can have a wide open lane, like no screeners, and just rip a wrist shot past a goalie. Yeah. It's like, that's one of the most elite shots. Like, I can't believe that. And a guy like Hoaglander has looked so good. And what I love about him, he's a bit more diminutive of a player, smaller player, but like the way he can use his body and gain body position on players, even though he's small, like that is really cool. I see that in Stützle a lot, and I saw Appleton make some really awesome body positioning moves. Now, remember, Stützle, people say he's a smaller guy. He's actually 6'1", but like I can see him being also physical with the body position and stuff. So right, like those are the rays of hope. But
for
like,
sure.
But like they're rays of hope because they're shining through a lot of cracks, right? In this roster, I think, or someone as reliable as Tanev is just so missed right now. Yeah. If we look at a guy like Quinn Hughes, I know plus minuses and everything, but to lead like the league in defensive scoring while also having in the teens in the minus columns.
Yeah, this early in the season.
There's a juxtaposition there that I think there are some weaknesses that cannot be hidden, or there's some synergy that doesn't exist between Quinn Hughes and his defensive partners. And we talked about Schmidt actually being more kind of an offensive two-way guy as well. And so he's not going to mitigate that to the same extent that Tanev, a really reliable guy, as we mentioned before, will have. So if I had to pick a pal, which I think like the option is either to buy or to sell, I would probably say don't do either. But if you really wanted to make a case for someone to add, you might be interested who I came up with. And don't get excited or don't get too excited about what I'm going to bring up. But if they had to add one player that I think will help them play, it's actually Danny DeKeyser. Of all the players that I could come up with, I was like, they need someone steady and reliable in the defending zone.
Right.
If you look at Detroit, now DeKeyser, if you go back to his recent numbers in the last 2 years, he's had a back injury. And so that's going to really maybe cool your excitement. But if you go back just a couple years further, even still, this team was historically bad. And if we look that... and some of the things that he's put up, he's had a relative Corsi of 0.8 on about 60% defensive zone starts or 57% defensive zone starts.
That's crazy.
So that means he's starting in the defensive zone and he's able to move the puck out of the end. And I think that even though this isn't very sexy, he and Quinn Hughes paired together, I think would work really well.
Yeah.
And now you might be going, oh, that's like a disgusting move, or why would they do that? Like, Quinn Hughes should be a top guy, DeKeyser should not. Well, let's think about this historically from other perspectives, okay? I think the most prime example of this is, we could look currently with Weber and Sherratt. Now, there's different elements there, but is Sherratt necessarily one of the 60 best defensemen in the league? He would be closer to 60.
I love him, but he's not. Yeah.
Right? And so, but that chemistry, right, that synergy really works for what those players need from each other. Yeah. The best example by far, I think, is Mark Methot, Erik Karlsson.
For sure. Yeah, I was going to say.
Right, Mark Methot has been a really good player, but he was really reliable, dependable in the defensive end. He could hang back and he can make a calm and collected play in the defensive end and get the puck out. And I believe strongly, if you look at some of DeKeyser's possession numbers, he'll do that. Okay, so I was thinking of other candidates like Savard and Columbus, but I don't think that Columbus is really selling at this point. I think they're always going to try and perpetually win. And at first I was wondering, well, who's going to go the other way? Because the money thing is the really issue, right? So there's been some rumors about Virtanen. Yeah. Now, I don't think Virtanen for DeKeyser is the best bang for your buck. I think Canucks will hope for a bigger return than that. So I was looking in other places, and you know what I realized is that Sven Barchi is being paid $3.4 million on the cap. He's got 1 year left, so you could convince Detroit to retain half the money. He makes $6 million, and he's got 1 year left after this. So if he's got 2 years at $3 million, and you have a guy like Sven Barchi going the other way, I think it's worth the risk. Detroit fans, I was talking to some, are really hopeful, maybe too hopeful, that the cost for him could be a second and a prospect, maybe a A or B prospect
for DeKeyser.
For DeKeyser.
Okay,
And I think that they can get that if this salary is retained, and because he's got 1 more year on his contract, perhaps a conditional second, and someone like Jet Wu. Now, I know Canucks fans might really like Jet Wu, but I think in the short term, in where this team is cap-wise, that having $3 million Danny DeKeyser could be a really worthwhile experiment for pairing with a guy like Luke Hughes. So those are some of the numbers that...
Luke Hughes.
Or Luke Hughes. We're getting a little bit ahead. They could draft Luke Hughes this year, but for Quinn. So, those are some of my thoughts. Because, again, guys like Beagle and Roussel, maybe they have some playoff value, but they also have modified no trades. And so you can expect Detroit is not going to be on their list. And so that's why I think Sven Barchi, great candidate, not even on their taxi squad right now. And so easy way to maybe free some money to do something like that. That's my Valentine's Day prediction.
For sure. That's some good matchmaking. I think that right now, that's sort of thing is the way that the management of the Canucks need to be thinking in terms of how are we going to surround these really bright young players with other players who are going to help them develop and maximize their strengths. And I think DeKeyser would be a perfect way to do that. If I'm a Canucks fan, I don't want Benning being the one trying to accomplish that. But I do think that DeKeyser would be a great way to make that happen. Cool. Well, how about we move on to the Oilers? Is there are there any matches you see that could be made for them?
Okay, I do, but I might set the scene a little bit here. Is that I feel that the defensive aspect that the Oilers have or that they don't have is really hampering them. I think that they need players that have attention to detail or high hockey IQ, because I think there's no qualms about what they can do in the offensive end. But Koskinen's played well, Mike Smith's played well, but I just don't think that they're reliable. I think they're playing a lot more run and gun than Toronto, which we expected would also play more run and gun as well. They're doing that even more so. So I think that they need someone with that high IQ, and I think forwards wise, if they could do that, that would be great, but I just don't see anyone with a high IQ being available on the market right now, because most of those players, because of their IQ or because of their defensive prowess, they're playing on teams that aren't selling. So I'm looking at the defensive end, and I think that Edmonton's got kind of a lot of guys who may have been a little bit overvalued. I know Clefbaum's out, but I think guys like Nurse are really great pieces to have. And even Larson's looked well this year. But yeah, he's paired with Legason, who could be a good piece, but maybe he's a bit of flash in a pan, something like Frederick Claesson for Sens fans might relate to. So I feel like there needs to be some really high IQ defense move made. They need just some reliability. Ethan Bear, I don't think it's a problem. He's injured. He's got really good outlet pass percentage. And so I'm looking at a team like Anaheim, and I'm wondering how much are they willing to sell. They got some players left who are in their late 20s and who are under control for another year. I think those are both really appealing things for Edmonton. So I'm looking at a guy like Josh Manson. There's a hiccup. He's got a modified no trade, but I think the opportunity to play with McDavid and Draisaitl could, if he does have Edmonton on his no team list, I think when he thinks about it a little further, that could assuage him towards either taking them off the list, or maybe he's not even on. Edmonton's not even on their list in the first place. So I think Josh Manson would be a great fit because there's a lot of rock solid defensive reliability. He's got a lot of leadership. He wears an A on Anaheim right now, so it might be tough to part with. But he makes 4.1 for this year and next. And a guy like Chiasson is making $2 million, actually over $2 million, 2.1, 2.2 million. And so if Manson is retained at 50%, that means that if Chiasson is sent the other way, who I think is expendable enough, then obviously you're going to need to add quite a bit of value to that. I think perhaps a first, a conditional second, maybe even Samorukov, who's a really good defensive prospect, going the other way. I don't think guys like Broberg or Bouchard will be in that deal, but it might sound like a lot of value for Oilers fans. But you're getting a lot of value back, and you're getting extended control. So I think it's worth spending a first, a second, and Samorukov for a player of that caliber. And
Manson can play. He's been when they used to have some success on that Anaheim team, he was a really big part of that.
Yeah. So you could argue maybe why didn't I bring that up for Vancouver if you were checking out our Vancouver segment? I think there's there can be an argument to be made there, but for the sake of just a little bit of variety in our takes, I think Josh Manson as an Oiler is just a really good fit. And so, again, that second round pick's going to have to be booted down the road because Andreas Athanasiou is no longer on the team, and Edmonton's given up 2 seconds for him, and now he's got 5 points in 7 games with the Kings. So that's got to burn a little bit, but it's not like LA is doing that well.
Right.
It's getting a big role. So that's kind of who I've got matched up there. I think that'll make a big difference for not having to play a run and gun style, at least for a few more minutes of the games.
Yeah, well, Valentine's Day is a time where some people are sad because you think about what you've lost. And it's true that sometimes you never know what you have until it's gone. And Oilers fans have experienced that with a certain fine young man who's currently second in the league for points among defensemen in Jeff Petrie. And I think we could potentially be coming up to a similar situation. I hope not, but I think it's possible with Darnell Nurse, where I think you've got a guy who's just not been put in a position to succeed. And I see really some of the narrative and public perception changing on him over time. And I just want to bring up the Petrie situation as a reminder to appreciate what you have while you have it. I think Nurse is a real player, and I think if he was in a different spot, he could have been like a superstar by now. And so I just really think that Nurse needs to be kept and protected and surrounded with support. I think he's someone who you build around.
Manson could maybe even complement that, right?
Man, like that would be so good.
Now I think they might have the same shot, so either that insulates him a little bit to thrive more in the second pairing, or if there's even chemistry for them to play together, right? I think that Manson could have some supports or detracts, but it's a very good point about Darnell Nurse, and maybe I've even fallen the victim to that.
Yeah, well, it's easy to, right? Because objectively, like just how he's performed, there's room for criticism. But I think it's important to look at the reasons for that performance. If I had to make a match for the Oilers, what I do is I put myself in their shoes and I look around and I look for something where I see some tension in a relationship just around the corner, and I'm hoping for a split. If I'm an Oilers fan, I'm hoping that the Montreal Canadiens implode and that they sell Philip Deneau as a rental because he doesn't make a lot against the cap hit. And when I think of a player, if I could pick any third-line center for that team behind McDavid and Draisaitl, it's Philip Deneau. I think that the main reason for their struggles this season, aside from goaltending, this might even be more so than goaltending in my opinion, is their bottom six. Has been just, it's made of scraps. Like it's just not enough. And if I think of what a Philip Deneau could do out there, where if you watch him play, he is not a very skilled offensive player, but he's going to generate goals by taking the puck out of his own end and just getting it to the other team's end and just volume chances. And if the Oilers could be spending less time in their own end, that's like the best thing that you could have for them would be less time in your own end, you know?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to my points, right, that I was saying about, like, need players with better IQ, I think, for the game. Now, of course, they've got Connor McDavid, Draisaitl. We're saying, aside from that, those players can't do that from the bench either, right? So a guy like Deneau definitely speaks.
And like, to be honest, that's not going to happen. But I think he's the archetype of a player who you want if you're an Oilers fan. And I'm not sure that any, like you said, I'm not sure any are available right now. And since that's the case, what do you do? And I think a guy like Manson is the next best thing. To, you know what, maybe he doesn't help quite as much right now, but he's gonna bring more to the table than just what's happening when he's on the ice because of the the way he's going to help out a guy like Nurse and some of your other defensemen and add that way. So
we're not being naive that there's a quarantine period, right? That's needed for all this, but like that would be worth the wait for this team to make sure that they've got a guy like Manson in the bag. The season's so short that they'll be statistically relevant, I think, the whole time. And when Manson can finally play, then I think it's worth the wait for sure.
Yeah.
And also kind of what I was thinking earlier is that like the Kyle Turris thing, it's been too bad, I think, because I don't think Turris has carved out his niche there. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier, and I got some flack for it, that I think Turris's niche is playing center with higher end players, and I had suggested maybe putting Draisaitl on the wing and putting him with Turris. I was in reference to Turris playing with Hoffman and Mark Stone in 2017 Eastern Conference Finals for the Senators, where he was a first line guy. Yeah. But yeah, it's clear that what you also said, where we're looking at the bottom six, Turris is not able to enable that kind of player to play their best either offensively or defensively, and for him also to play his best offensive or defensively. He has a really hard time getting into the game there, which is too bad. I don't think he's going to move up in the lineup, but that's the way that I'd seen it. And something that a guy like Friedman had also observed as well would be a good situation for Turris. But
and if I had to think of in some universe where a Danault trade could happen, I think a guy like Turris becomes very valuable because, and again, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if there's some universe where it could, I would be very interested in what a Danault, Nugent, Hopkins swap could look like, because Nuge brings way more offensively to the table than Danault, yes, he's kind of done wonders for the top six in that the way he's playing recently has helped them have two really good lines, and you can separate, the two big guns and have some success. But Turris is a guy who can thrive in a top six role, like you said. And Montreal, I think, needs. Man, sometimes watching Danault in the offensive zone is painful. Like, it's just a struggle, and Nuge brings a lot more in that way, and the Montreal plays team defense so well typically that, and like it's not like Nuge is good defensively too. Like it's not like he's a liability in that way, and they're both expiring at the end of the year. That's just something that is like, maybe if something was going to happen, that could work out in a world where the Habs don't collapse and they aren't just selling.
Right.
Where both, it's just kind of like change of scenery in a way that players with very different strengths. So then I would think like, hey, what would it look like to have Turris play up on the second line and take some draws. Maybe like him and Draisaitl. Draisaitl could technically be the center, but maybe defensively you have Turris prioritize being the first man. You know what I mean? You share defensive responsibilities. It could just be an interesting fit, I think. So that's something that I would be just curious. Hey, maybe there's some way something like that's possible. But
well, also staying in Edmonton, or staying in Alberta, that is, going down to Calgary. There's some things that you perceive that are needs for Calgary. We talked about, seems like secondary scoring was absent for the beginning of the season. That was really tough.
Well, I just want to quickly pat myself on the back a little bit for believing in Johnny Gaudreau. What a good hockey player. Credit. What a good hockey player. Not everyone felt that way because he had a sort of tough year last year. Not that tough, in my opinion, but I just think that guy's a gem. And he's been, I saw a stat that his individual points percentage, so basically the amount of his team's goals that he's a part of is like he was in the top 3 in the league thus far at the time of recording for individual points percentage, which is crazy. But the fact that he's playing so well, he was my sink or swim candidate for them. The fact that he's playing so well and they aren't doing as well as maybe some people had hoped.
Yeah.
I think really
people thought they could be top in the league. Some people even thought Winnipeg could be top in the league. Kudos to them for having some gusto to say, like, Winnipeg's a lot better than people are giving credit for.
Yeah.
And maybe is Calgary been given a little too much credit to start? I don't know.
Maybe, but I think that the fact that Gaudreau is playing so well, and even Monahan's doing well too, but it still feels like they're not doing quite what they could be, lends a lot of credence to your take on sort of their sink or swim candidate, and like you were saying, their lack of secondary scoring. So do you see any, if you look around with your matchmaking lens on, is there anything you see for them?
Right. Well, I think I have a few different thoughts. Well, and the first one is the fact that I believe that if there was any player that was made available, and it could be likely to be made available this year, it could be Connor Garland of the Arizona Coyotes. Now, he might not be a household name, but he is one heck of a player.
So good.
Yeah. As it stands, he's got 13 points in 12 games this year. He led
5 goals.
Yeah, exactly. And this on a team that's historically anemic for producing offense. And so I think that
he I think led the team in scoring last year, even though you have Taylor Hall, you have what's that kid's name who's
Keller.
Keller is really good. And he had 22 goals in like 68 games. Or 23 goals, but on pace for almost a 30-goal season. He's a big kid. He plays the right wing. He's strong. He's like, he doesn't have a lot of weaknesses in this game.
He can generate his own chances as well, which is something that we see when players go to different teams. All of a sudden, their ability to generate their own chances can be diminished, or it's exposed where maybe they were actually a beneficiary of another person's play. So you were kind of alluding to that with Dadonov, for example, and that has looked true for some of that season. But yeah, so I think Connor Garland should be the best thing on the market. But right now, Arizona's in the 4 hole. I know that they need picks. They've lost a lot of picks this year due to management and I guess cheating on the draft analysis of prospects and stuff. So I know that they need picks, but they're in the 4 hole right now in the West, and I think they've got all the reason to be in the hunt this year, and it could be even in one of the states that's allowed to have fans in the stands. So if they make come playoff time and there's no bubble, let's say, and they can have home games in the United States, which I think they'll really push for revenue-wise, I think Arizona's going to try and stay in the hunt. So it's likely he's not available. And even for when we were discussing Edmonton earlier, I thought Chalmerson would be a great candidate, but he's not going to waive his no move. He's made that clear. He's going to make that decision at the end of the year, even though he's an expiring player. So I like him the best, but in all likelihood, if he's not available, or I'm suspecting he's not available, I'm looking at circling back actually to rumors of Taylor Hall being a Flame. Now, we've maybe heard some of this in the past, but Buffalo has not gotten better in the standings. I'm not saying they're mathematically eliminated whatsoever, but the more that you lose, the quicker that you're going to be out of it. And I think that it could benefit Buffalo to recoup some assets by looking at moving a guy like Taylor Hall, which they essentially got for free. They didn't trade any assets for him. And if they can move Taylor Hall to Calgary, and I think that all those guys that you're hoping for secondary scoring from, they get put in a role like, I'm not saying this is the same caliber, but remember the HBK line with
Hagelin, Bonino, Kessel.
Exactly.
When the Penguins won their most recent cup, or was that 2 cups ago?
They were back-to-back.
Oh, okay, right.
There you go. Lines like that where you are just putting players who have got talent in an even better role to succeed on the third line, where you have Taylor Hall in your first, second line, however you want to do it. You have another power play threat, and I think you can just roll your lines out a little bit smoother that way. So I think that would be a great thing to look for. Now, again, the money matters is what it's all about. So if I was looking at how do we get Taylor Hall, then I mean, we've heard of Sam Bennett. He's made a trade request. He's looked better because he's been showcased in more of a top role. He's looked better, so that could be maybe something intriguing for Buffalo, where they've got an asset coming in a little bit cheaper, and they've got control. He'll be an RFA at the end of this year, so Buffalo might really like that, where they make something out of nothing if they decide that this season's a wash. And so I would say Sam Bennett maybe combined with Derek Ryan just for cap. I know Derek Ryan's played well, and he's very decent for the Flames' depth, but just the money has to work some way, right? So then Taylor Hall's contract can be retained in some order, and paying those two players for an upgrade, a former Hart winner in Taylor Hall, I think is a really, really good deal. You're probably going to have to add something, perhaps a conditional first.
I think you need to add a fair bit, in my opinion. But
yeah, some people might make the argument Sam Bennett's RFA and Taylor Hall is going to be UFA, and if he's quarantined for 14 days, right? Like, what does that do to his value? I think it's a conditional first where they can maybe choose to give up this year's first or next year's first. And also, like, we haven't mentioned this at all, but if the draft is pushed back, where we have 2 drafts in the summer of 2022, can you still trade the 2021 draft picks in the year 2022? That is a whack thought.
That'd be wild.
Yeah, we could maybe break that down in another video, but like,
that'd be crazy.
Right?
I'd never thought of that.
Could Calgary have the option of which first, according to how the standings, because they're in a really tight division this year. So I think Taylor Hall as a Flame would look good, maybe sacrilegious to some other Albertan residents, but I think that's the move. That's the way to go.
Well, I think those rumors were more than just rumors. I think there's been some real effort made by Calgary in the past to get him, and it's like they've been eyeing each other up from across the room for so long. Cute. And I think now is
very
the perfect
Valentines
time.
Theme. Yeah. Eyeing each other up at the dance.
Exactly. And now is like, if there was ever a time to bring in Taylor Hall, now you know he's exactly what you need. They'll complete each other, and it's just the time to make it happen. And I think if it does, it goes well enough that he strongly looks at re-signing there. Yeah. Because if it's a fit, what better thing could he want, right?
Exactly. And so I know some people are saying, well, if you throw maybe Lucic over to Buffalo, then that could make the cap work easier. I don't think he's that movable, unfortunately. Think of how much of his money is in bonus money. Yeah. And he's got 2 years remaining after this year. So I know that might be your rebuttal to my trade proposal, where I think it could be Ryan Bennett and a conditional first. You might say, let's just move Lucic in the first. I don't think it's as cut and dry, unfortunately.
No. Lucic, like, cap space and just money has never been as valuable as it is right now. Yeah. I guarantee you there is no owner in the league who's like, yeah, I'll pay that money in these times for Lucic. Right. There's no one. Yeah.
And even though the cap hit stings, I think Lucic has been put in a role that he can serve in Calgary, even though it's maybe a bit rich for that kind of money. I think that's fine. So we are going to be going to Winnipeg, but I really need to be.
Had to take a little intermission. I don't understand how people can go on the Joe Rogan podcast, be there for 3 hours and not have to pee.
No.
It just makes no sense to me.
They've just chosen to live a life celibate of coffee.
Not worth it. Well, yeah, we've made our way to Winnipeg here. So we're matchmaking today. But I just want to take a moment to appreciate the honeymoon stage that Winnipeg's finding themselves in right now. It's just been one of those situations where it's like, for so long, it just seemed like, no, that would never happen. I'm sure that would never work. But it actually happened. Like, Pierre-Luc Dubois is a Winnipeg Jet, and he was traded for Patrick Laine. This is the timeline we're living in. Like, how is that real?
It's like something that you, concoct on...
That's like an EA Sports NHL trade.
Exactly, right? And the other thing I think that really is an inspiration, at least in my eyes, for this whole segment of this Valentine's Day theme is like, how often do you pick a trade out, or do you scheme a trade where it's like, okay, well, this team's looking for this and that team's looking for that, so they should do a trade, right? Like, and how many times can you come up with all these different hypotheticals that just never happen? And this seemed one, it's like, well, okay, it's too good to be true, so if it hasn't happened already, it's probably not going to happen. And yet, boom, all of a sudden, like, the greatest hypothetical swap that almost never happens in the league happened. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely wild. I still can't believe it. So I think my motivation was low to come up with some really spicy matchmaking for the Jets, just because, like, just appreciate what you got. Like, I still can't believe that it happened, and I just couldn't think of a more perfect fit for the Jets than Dubois. I think he changes their whole identity as a team in a drastically, like, just the way, okay, that's maybe a little bit extreme. He changes the way that their whole forward group feels, like the line they swap for him, in a way that I think is going to be really positive for this team moving forward. So that said, do you have anyone when you look around that you'd like to maybe set up to pair with the Jets?
So I think it's pretty typical to look at the Jets defense and be like, that's the area that they need upgraded. Now, one thing I think that changes, because I'm actually not going to pick a defenseman. One thing that changes, I think the acquisition of Dubois, a guy who plays both ends of the ice quite well, I think that is a defensive acquisition in a sense. And contrasting that to Patrick Laine, and even though he paired well with Scheifele and Wheeler on the top line, there was a liability. It was better for him, but it wasn't better for the team as a whole.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so what Dubois can do on both ends of the ice is going to be really good. And so instead of looking for a defenseman that I think is available, I'm actually going right back to that second line right wing that they lost, okay, and finding someone that I think and I believe is really attainable. Now, it looks like some of the teams that I'm feasting on here are ones that are already out early.
Right.
So I've already picked Anaheim for candidate to trade with Edmonton, because Anaheim already looks out of it, and I don't think we expected them to be doing really any better than they are. And at this point in the season, it's really hard to determine who's eliminated or who's not going to be contending for a playoff spot, because things are so tight, and especially with the shortened season, there's this anything can happen kind of attitude with some of the teams. Now, Anaheim, I think, is without that right now. And I think they've got a lot of really good young pieces, so there could be some incentive to hold on to these players that I've mentioned, Josh Manson being one, and this other one for the Winnipeg Jets I think is a perfect pick, and that's Rickard Rakell, okay? Now, that might not be the sexiest pick for some people. That might seem like a very 2018 pick for some people. But honestly, I believe that if Rickard Rakell is made available, because guys like Manson with 1 year left, Rakell also has 1 year remaining after this. Remember, it's a flat cap, so having that cost control is a really, really important element. And I think that having...
So you're saying, as opposed to going for a rental, going for a guy who has another year.
Yes. And I think from an Anaheim perspective, they're like, okay, we like to have these players, but what's the likelihood that they're going to resign with us 2 years from now, or like 2 summers from now, right? And so I think that's got to be kind of in the back of their mind. And we've seen this with other players where Blake Coleman and Barclay Goodrow both go to Tampa Bay, each for first round picks plus, right? And these aren't guys who, they're definitely NHLers, right? But I don't think most people expected that cost to be there. So I think there's going to be a really nice return for Anaheim that will set them up. It might sound a little painful for some of you Jets viewers, but let me tell you exactly why Rickard Rakell, okay? So as I mentioned, the defense would be maybe an option to upgrade, but I think that Dubois really changes that, and this whole offense can be the best form of defense. Maybe I'm speaking out of two sides of my mouth throughout the podcast, but I think that can really be true. Now, Rickard Rakell is a right-hand shot, and Ehlers is a left-hand shot. And if you put, say, a Dubois or Scheifele in the middle of that on a second pairing or a second line, I think that could be really, really potent. Like, I think that works out really, really well. And I know Rickard Rakell's numbers have slumped the last years, but we're going to talk about those numbers for just a brief moment. And I think I can articulate some points that can get you to buy into this idea. The other thing that's really cool, Ehlers can and likes to play on the off wing occasionally, and so does Rickard Rakell. So they can both play off wings, and maybe that's a really good power play option that they can have, or maybe one of them can play the high slot sort of option there. And like I mentioned, the cost and the control. So
while you're getting ready to share some of those numbers, something that I really like about where you're going with this is how important it is in this league to buy low on players. And I think that this would be the time to buy low on Rickard Rakell. I think he's a player who, and this may be some of the stuff you're going to talk about, but I think he's a player who is at his best when he's playing with really good players. And Ryan Getzlaf is not the player who he used to be.
No.
Rakell, I think, struggles when he really has to kind of create some of his own offense. That's not his identity as a player. And when you imagine like just perfectly crafting a line, you have Ehlers, who is an elite play driver.
Yeah.
You have Dubois, who is an incredible, creative, dynamic playmaker who can also finish. He can be at the front of the net. There's no part of the ice he has to avoid, right?
Yeah.
He can take the puck anywhere and disperse it, on a whim. And so I think that is the dream scenario for a guy like Rakell to flourish and hopefully bounce back. So I guess why don't you talk a bit about that idea of him bouncing back and why that might be?
Right. So I'll just talk about some of his numbers here. And I'm going to contrast this to some players who are inevitably going to have to go the other way. That's just the way it is. To get value, you've got to give up some value. Okay. And so when I'm looking at his best 2 seasons, now this is 2017 and 2018, which may feel to some of us an eternity ago, but his best numbers, he got 51 points in one season and 69 points in another season. And he's got 30 goals, multiple occasions as well, which I think is really, really good. And yeah, he even got some Lady Bing votes. So he's a really disciplined player, which I think that narrative of the Jets being a really penalized team has gone away. But he's not going to be a liability for putting your team down chances, right? For a PK. And so he's really good in that aspect. He's got a career shooting of 11.5%, which is pretty good, especially considering the last couple years when Anaheim's really made this precipitous drop from, now this might shock you, but in when Rakell's put up his best numbers in 16, 17, and 18, Anaheim was first in the Pacific, and third in the Pacific. So hockey changes really fast, but he was putting up good numbers on good teams, and he was shooting about 18, 14, 12% there. And the last couple of years playing on a team that's really almost been gutted or has decayed, he's been shooting kind of around 6 and 8%, which is low for him. And also because he's been asked to drive so much offense, he's just volume shooting. And so there aren't enough people to make plays or not enough people to help generate goals. So he's been asked to shoulder a lot of that, and he's struggled at the start of this year. He gets good time on ice. He gets about 18 minutes a night, and the good part is he makes $3.78 million. I'm rounding $3.78 million for this year and next year.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and so like I mentioned, in 16 he had 20 goals, and in 17 he had 33 goals, and in 18 he had 34 goals, and in each of those he hadn't quite played 82 games either. So there, if you extrapolate those numbers for points per season, then those can be even higher with some luck and some health. So now it comes the question, who's going the other way? And this might be tough for some people who may view this as a fan favorite. And I'm willing to take a bit of blow for this, but I think Perreault makes the most sense cap-wise to go back the other way. He makes $4.1 million, and I know he does a lot. Some people think that he's super valuable, short-handed. He's got a motor that just keeps running, and that's good. And I think sometimes his motor keeps turning and turning, and it can sometimes mean he's moving too fast to make the right play, or he might be overzealous in making a check, and there can be some defensive liability there. Now, I understand he's got a good role. He's a role player, but he's making $4.1 million. And those same years where Raquel had his best statistical seasons, so did Matthew Perreault. And he got 44 points and 45 points were his career highs, okay? And again, just a reminder that Raquel had 51 and 69. So there's clearly an improvement there. There's offensive prowess, and we talked about the chemistry before between Dubois and Ehlers. I think that's totally there. Maybe a hiccup could be that Perreault's got a 5-team no-trade list. However, Perreault previously played for Anaheim, where he did have his statistically best career season. So, you can maybe hope for him looking at a place like Ottawa, Detroit, Buffalo, maybe being on his no-trade list, something like that, right? So then there's already a probability that Anaheim could be open.
New Jersey.
Right.
These days.
If they slumped, I have a hard time.
How long has it been since they've played?
That's
just
true.
With the COVID situation, that franchise is just in a little bit of trouble as well.
Yeah, they looked good for a bit, but that's maybe for a different day as well.
For sure.
And of course, we're doing Canadian League, so how can you not pay attention to only things north of the border too? But I think that this is an excellent fit. Now, Perreault might hurt, but cap-wise, like I said, he makes 4.1. Raquel makes 3.78, but as much as it might pain Jets, you're going to need to add to that, okay? Raquel is a good player, guys, that score 30 goals. Don't grow on trees, and I think 30 goals in this era, or at least in the last couple of years that we've seen, has been a lot more like the 40 goal scores that we've expected in years past. So 30 goals is actually a lot nowadays for players. So what I see is something like Perreault, and then either a Vesalainen or Gustafsson. Now, it's nice to have Gustafsson and Raquel on the same team. There's a bit of a Swedish connection there, maybe incentivizing, but I think Gustafsson is worth more. So I see Perreault, Gustafsson, a first, and possibly even Declan Chisholm. Because remember, he's signed for one more year after this. So that is a really big factor that we need to consider. This isn't just a rental. This is a player that you're retaining for some time. So that means value has to go the other way, and you have to convince Anaheim, who is not totally at rock bottom, to part with a guy who's turning 28 this year only.
So and been a huge part of their identity for a long time.
Exactly.
Just a quick note. Calculations have been done, and interestingly enough, a player... basically, I believe the study was kind of done by comparing, like, you sort of assign a role to a player, like second line offensive winger, second line defensive, you assign all these roles, and they've gone back year by year and looked at trades and kind of the return that was given back, and it's hard to approximate value at the time, right? But that was what was the attempt. And players are at their most valuable in terms of the most return they fetch in a trade in the state Raquel would be now, where they have where they're a trade deadline move or close to, who's not just a rent for the rest of the season, but 1 year left.
Yeah, definitely.
When they have more contract left, the value drops a little bit. And when they have less contract left, the value drops a bit as well. So I agree that it would be a pretty steep cost.
Yeah.
I do think that there's no way Cheveldayoff trades his first again. I think he probably just couldn't stomach that anymore. But
perhaps there is Perfetti maybe coming up on a ELC, and Roslovic's also looked kind of decent in Columbus, so that's maybe bites a bit.
I wouldn't be surprised if Anaheim asks for a first if in these imaginary negotiations. and he comes back, Chevy comes back with, say, like a second, another later round pick, and like take your pick of this group of prospects, or you know what I mean? Yeah. As opposed to like making up a bit of that value instead of, I personally wouldn't, I could be wrong, but yeah, I just think that it's hard to trade as many first round picks as they have in not super recent history, but medium to short term history, and be successful. Fair. So that's just my gut feel. But
okay, yeah, that's cool. And yeah, for those of you who are like, no, defense is the clearest need. Even if they made a move for Raquel, some of what you're taking off the roster, I think, even with a quarantine period, is definitely easy for Jets to do better than tread water with the addition of Dubois already playing. If they had to wait a couple weeks for Raquel to quarantine, cross the border, I think that is totally worth it personally. And what this actually does, because Raquel makes less than Perreault, is that if you are insisting that there needs to be another defenseman added, then what could happen is maybe a guy like Forbort or Beaulieu, who's making a little bit of money, he could maybe go with some more draft capital or whatever needs to be added to get a guy like Vince Dunn, possibly from the Blues, who's been rumored on the way out. He's controlled. He's an RFA coming up. So with little on LTIR, then there's going to be enough cushion to you're saving money with Raquel and maybe a guy like Gustafsson or Vesalainen coming off your taxi squad. Maybe you go down a player, and then if you ship out Beaulieu or Forbort, who each make about 1.4 and 1 million respectively, then you've got a little bit of wiggle room to get a lower echelon defenseman that might help, might be a slight bump, or at least be younger and under control for this team. So there are other iterations and possibilities. It clears cap for them to use LTIR better as well. So that's important to note.